welcome back to the LPP Conference YouTube channel. My name is Ben. I'm a volunteer with the LPP Conference, and today I'm really excited to share an interview with the organizers of the LPP Conference, Drs. Mela Sarkar and Amir Kalam. I sat down with both of them last week to talk about past LPP conferences, this year's LPP conference, themes that they're looking forward to in this year's conference, and their ideas for how the LPP conference will move forward in the future. I hope you enjoy watching. And remember, the conference is from August 26th to the 28th. Register now. All right, enjoy.
Well, you know, I knew about this conference when it had started in Calgary, when Tom Ricento started it, 10 years ago, but I didn't have the funds to get out to Calgary, although I knew it was going to be great. And as soon as it came to Toronto, I started going because I'm from Toronto and I can stay there for free. And I really wanted to see what was happening with Jeff Bale and Eve Hawk's, organization of the conference. So I went all 3 years it was in Toronto, 2017, 18, and 19. And every year it was great. It's a conference that I completely fell in love with this conference, and I just wanted it to go on and on. And so it's hard to single out individual moments. But I was thinking about that, and I think that a real high point for me was in the 2019 conference when I met Kristen Snodden for the first time. Kristen is a researcher at Carleton, and of course she's been very prominent in the deaf community as a researcher about the sign language of the deaf. And I knew about her work, and she had published with a friend of mine, Shelley Taylor, and she had actually been one of the keynotes in 2018. In 2019, they announced that the conference would be in Montreal the following year, of which, of course, it had to be canceled because of COVID. But then everybody knew that I would be one of the chairs in Montreal in 2020. And Kristen came running up to me, and I was standing in front of the stage where Jonathan Rosa had just finished his keynote, and I was recording it for a friend. So I was kind of unplugging everything that I had plugged in. And so there's Jonathan Rosa on the stage, and he's pretty amazing. And there's Kristen with her interpreter and yakking away. And I hadn't actually met her before. I had just known about her and had a couple of emails with her. And it was so interesting to have that interaction with the interpreter present, but the person also present, the person who's speaking ASL, right? I mean, I can't speak ASL, but, she was asking something about the 2020 conference, and we've been in touch. So that I felt like, wow, this is a conference I really want to stick with. And as it happens, Kristen will be one of the special guests at this year's conference because Enrique Picardo of Oise has organized the invited colloquium that fortunately they were willing to postpone from the canceled conference to this year. So Kristen is one of the speakers, one of the participants in the colloquium. So it's all kind of, meshing together over time and fitting together into this, LPP over many years experience for me. And I think I'm going to love it. And I think this year it's going to really feel, I hope it's going to feel like a continuation of previous years, despite the fact that it's no longer, one, no longer in person, but online this year. Two, not in the same place being hosted, technically speaking, although it's, and three, we had this gap because of having to miss 2020. But I think it's going to have a lot of continuity, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Absolutely, yes. The LPP conference was held actually for 3 years at the Ontario Institute of Studies in Education of University of Toronto, typically referred to as OISE. Unfortunately, I didn't happen to be at OISE at that time, although I'm an OISE graduate. So I was writing up my doctoral research, and I was conducting my research in the United States. And I was, but at the same time, I was following the developments of the conference. So I've always been fascinated at the kind of at the right size of this conference. So this conference is neither too large, where there are a lot of scholars around, but you seem to be a little bit lost when it comes to the dimensions of the conference. And it's not too small, so you can reach out to people locally, but there are fewer opportunities for interacting with international scholars and even national scholars in some cases. So I've always thought that it's a really, the conference has a very interesting size, and that's why reason I decided to support and organize the conference, really. So what I'm looking forward to is, Ben, we are going through a transition in language education and policy. I think the field we know as applied linguistics is questioned in different ways, and I think new kind of perspectives have been added to our conversations about TESOL, second language education, language policy, and language planning. So social movements like Black Lives Matter, like I Don't Know More, the relations between settler colonial states and Aboriginal populations. Those conversations have come to the forefront because of different reasons. So I'm looking forward to just to listening to presentations to see how different people in the field, particularly Canadian scholars, because that's closer to me as a Canadian academic, how they're responding to these changes in the field. I think this is a very, very exciting time. As the theme of this year's conference highlights, there are other movements like translanguage and plurilingualism. So they have created a lot of conversation. Sometimes they have polarized scholars. So I think it's really interesting to see how the field is responding to these changes. And let's not forget the pandemic. So we have been going through a pandemic, and that's a huge change. In fact, I think the pandemic has given momentum to a lot of those social movements to become more visible in different ways. So that's what I'm really looking forward to. How are we responding to our field or to our fields, because the conference is really interdisciplinary as well. So how are different scholars responding to this, and what stances they are taking? That's a very, I'm really curious to learn about that.
You know, there's, speaking about the relationship, Amir was just talking about the relationship between settler colonial states and speakers of, you know, the non-dominant languages. And there's lots about, I would say, minoritized languages, including about Indigenous languages, which is going to be so interesting because it's now taken off and become a field that is very active, as opposed to, you know, 10 or 20 years ago when there was just a trickle of papers at a conference like this about Indigenous languages. And Nancy Hornberger, who is one of our plenary speakers, is going to really focus on the question of Indigenous languages and policy in the Global South, because her work has been in the Andes, as most people would know. And so we have a plenary which is really devoted to that whole issue. But there's also papers about racial linguistics, as Amir was mentioning. There has been this polarization between people talking about translanguaging and people talking about plurilingualism, and there will be people representing all those points of view there. But another of our plenary speakers is Sami Alim, Hesham Sami Alim from UCLA, and he's going to be focusing on something about racial linguistics because that's what he's been doing the last few years. And so I think that follows very nicely from previous plenaries who were in 2019, Jonathan Rosa, and in 2018, Nelson Flores. So there's going to be very interesting, I think, contrasting points of view and opportunities for debate. So we have to really try to organize some kind of social space where people can interact informally, as opposed to the Zoom rooms where the actual papers will be presented, and it's always tight for time, and you're rushing people off and rushing people on. But I think that these people will want to talk to each other, and we have to make it possible for them to do that. That's definitely one of the things that from previous conferences I remember so well, is that you're in the same room, having lunch or coffee or just milling about in the open spaces at OISE with all sorts of people who it would be very tricky to track them down and actually email them and have a conversation at random. But at the conference, there's all these people from all these different disciplines and backgrounds, and it's very interdisciplinary, as Amir said. And you can just say, hey, I'm so and so. Here's my label, and I want to talk to you about this thing you said. And it was great, and I think a lot of people did take advantage of that opportunity. And of course, for graduate students, it's great because they typically haven't had that opportunity as much. So I actually forget what the question is now. What's the question?
Yeah, we were talking about our favorites, the themes that we see, I think, in the presentations.
Oh, right. There's loads and loads. There's many different themes. Of course, there's lots about classrooms. There's always lots about, how policy affects what happens in classrooms. And so they have a kind of a pedagogical focus as well as a policy focus. But there's always lots about sort of top-down language policy at the governmental level and how that affects people's lives and not just people's education, but people's lives in all sorts of other ways. And of course, a lot of that is going to have to do with the minoritized languages that get the short end of the stick because of top-down language policy often being very repressive. So there's going to be lots of that.
Yeah, if I think Mela listed, I think that the themes, I think very well, and I think that these are really these themes represent, I think, the majority of the presentations. I don't have much to add to this. Just developing the theme of a kind of minoritized languages, or the presence of presentations which focus on minoritized languages. Mela, I agree with you that that's very important to have that large pool, unlike probably not necessarily previous years, but I mean, unlike previous decades.
Other conferences don't do that quite as much, I don't think.
Yeah, so I think it's really fascinating to see that large pool, particularly because I think as we look at those debates in the field, I think debates like translanguaging or racial linguistics, I think we shouldn't forget that most of the time, I think these concepts are rooted in debates about the differences between European languages. So I think we have tried to highlight the fact that if you're talking about translanguaging or plurilingualism, we really recommend that we should move beyond European languages only. So it has been really great to see that there are these different clusters of presentations, for instance, about Aboriginal languages, or even languages like the Kurdish language. So some languages that sometimes are referred to as stateless languages. So it's really amazing to see that in this conference, at least, we don't see the typical obsession of applied linguistics with European languages. And I think there is more space for minoritized languages. And that's one of my favorite themes. Yeah.
Which
I think it's growing. It's definitely been there, but it's because I would always look for those papers. And in 2017, there weren't nearly as many. I know because I went to all of them that I could. There were some very interesting papers, individual papers about Indigenous languages in Canada and the States. And I can't remember exactly, but I think there are definitely more this year. And another thing, so Amir mentioned non-European languages, but it's important to remember that there are also colonial languages that are non-European languages. And so, for example, I know that there's at least one paper on Japanese as a language that is kind of a problem for Indigenous people in Japan, in Ryukyu specifically, and how they're fighting to preserve their language, which is an Indigenous language of Japan, and also papers about minoritized languages in China, which is a pretty big deal, actually, given the Chinese government policy of having everybody have to learn Mandarin hand Chinese sort of, spreading. So looking at Chinese as a colonial language or, a colonizing language in a very different way from how English is in North America, or Japanese and other languages, which for example, India, there's papers about Indigenous communities in India where they are very much kind of marginalized by the central government. So that's something that people are now becoming more and more aware of, and there's more interest in. And I actually can never remember what the question is, Ben. You have to. The question.
No, I think Ben's question is very important. I mean, he was talking about how it is different from other conferences in that regard. I agree with Mela that it is growing, and we are happy that we can showcase some of those presentations. But at the same time, Ben, I think the change which has happened is, I think, previously you might see kind of presentations about those languages, but they wouldn't be in a kind of mainstream applied linguistics or language policy conference, because I think traditionally those conversations were not regarded as kind of as having equal impact. I think what is fascinating with this conference this year, and we are hopeful that it will happen next year with more intensity, is really bringing these conversations into center stage. So these conversations are not only, they shouldn't just happen in conferences, for instance, focusing on Japan or India. I think when we claim that we are talking about translanguaging, I think we really have to include all languages and all experiences. So based on my experience with the organizing team, I think the attitude has been very inclusive. So we just don't invite people from India or Kurdistan to present, to have a few tokens of what those people are doing. I think they deserve to be actually in the center stage, and we should probably just pause and listen to them, to learn from them, rather than to teach them and then create some space for them to repeat our theories. So I think this has been the general attitude of the organizers and hopefully the reviewers. So we see that there is that trend, and I really appreciate that trend.
Okay, well, we certainly opened it up so that we could, but in fact, we have one talk which is going to be fully in French, and but it's not about Canada, actually. It's about it's going to be a very interesting talk by Maria Apostolovic, who is Serbian but lives in Paris, and is going to be presenting about her work with the Romani people in Serbia and their education system, but she happens to be doing it in French. So it's going to be very good. I know that paper well. But there are lots of people who are going to have other languages on their slides and do a kind of a mixed version where there's bits in, for example, Arabic or Spanish or Portuguese. But as far as I know, there are no presentations completely in a language which isn't English or in the one case French. I think because people are worried that nobody will come, which I think isn't actually the case, because if you put it in with in a session with other papers that people aren't going to have a problem understanding, and you have lots of stuff on the slides that's in English, then it's okay to speak the other language. I've been to conferences that work that way, but we really hoped that the plurilingual possibility. Well, it was a possibility. Let's see if next year, because hopefully next year people are gonna pick up on this. Next year will be a more normal year because it won't be delayed by a year of pandemic and general panic. But I just wanted to put in, okay, other languages besides English, because this is the first year that the conference is being hosted in Quebec and in Montreal. Quebec is sort of is Canada's language policy corner. Here our tax money, we pay huge taxes, and a big chunk of it goes to something called the Office québécois de la langue française, which is the Quebec office of the French language, which is a language planning office that tax dollars support here. Quebec is different about language policy. Everybody knows that. So our opening plenary speaker is Patricia Lamar at the University of Montreal, who is going to speak about language policy with a focus on Quebec, and that's also new this year, and it was very important, I think, that we make sure that was forefronted. So I'm very glad she can be the opening plenary, just because people who aren't familiar with Quebec will find it interesting that there is this kind of we live and breathe language policy here in Montreal, especially. You can't go into a store and open your mouth without making a language policy statement. right? That's definitely true here in Montreal. And there are places there are other places in the world where people also are very aware of the ways in which they are going to be judged and privileged or not privileged or whatever because of the language policy environment. And they will see that hopefully they will get a sense of the ways in which Quebec is like and unlike those places. But there are certainly people who have never heard of that really happening or experienced it. I just wish they could be here in person. But they'll get a sense, I think, because of the many papers that are by Montreal scholars and about the Montreal situation. So that's something that's a bit different this year, just because, you know, we get to say, well, here we are in Montreal and we want to mention X because it's a very important thing here in Montreal.
I think one reason to highlight that was definitely connecting the conference with the ongoing conversations and debates that we discussed at the beginning. So these are important trends. There are people who support them and have been writing about them, and there are people who are more critical of these themes. I think it's very important really to highlight this theme, to, as Mela explained, to create that venue for conversation, because definitely I think they have contributed to a criticality that has been lacking in applied linguistics and language policy, or at least has been kind of marginalized in different ways. So that was one reason. I think one member of the group who is not here anymore is Professor Angelica Galanta. She particularly focuses on plurilingualism. Mela can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think she might have been influential in developing that theme as well. And I think personally, I think that's a very important thing. Part of that also could be, again, the same kind of decolonial stance. So if you look at plurilingualism beyond, again, just French and English in Canada, and beyond Spanish and English in the United States, which I feel most of the conversations really just attract those those viewpoints. I think the kind of plurilingual lens could help us really decolonize the field in different ways and create possibilities for decolonization. I think one reason that we advocated for that, and we opened the space for any language. We discussed, I think, different meetings, how we would kind of scaffold those presentations in a way that everybody could really have a fruitful time listening to those. But the reality that there were not a lot of applications, I think, shows that there is something probably wrong with the way we are structured traditionally conferences in North America, particularly conferences that claim to have an international character. So I think we have been trying to be inclusive, and I think we're learning from this conference that we might need to just reform the structure of the conference in a way that accommodates those presentations more than it has this time.
I was at a conference in Oaxaca, Mexico in 2011. It's called Bilingue Latam, Bilingual Latin America. And it's a conference that is not held that regularly, and it every 2 or 3 years, and it moves around Latin America. And it sort of depends on who was able to host it. But that year it was hosted by I forget the name of the university in Oaxaca, but Mario Gopal Lopez, or anyway, who is an OISE PhD, and he did a wonderful job putting this conference together and helping host it with other people. And there were so many presentations there that were in Spanish or Portuguese that I did not understand, except for the fact that there had to be something on the slides. Either the person was speaking Spanish or Portuguese and there was English on the slides, or the people were speaking English and there was Spanish or Portuguese on the slides, because many of the people attending the conference didn't speak English, but they spoke Spanish or Portuguese. And then I didn't speak very much Spanish. I spoke a little bit, tourist Spanish, and spoke English. So the conference had to accommodate everybody, and it was fascinating. And it actually meant that what happened at that conference, I picked up what I could, but it meant that I kind of grabbed my neighbor who clearly understood the Spanish and said, "Can you tell us what's going on?" He's like, and that was a good way to talk to people. And I got a lot out of all the presentations that I didn't understand 100% of, because I understood 80 or 85%, and that's enough. I think that's a good way to go forward into more inclusive and way more interesting, linguistically more interesting conferences. I just wish that that more people were thinking that way, because I don't know now about AAAL, which is the American Association of Applied Linguistics in the States, but I know that when I was part of co-hosting with our Canadian Association, co-hosting that conference in 2015, they had a kind of they had a language policy that said that all presentations have to be in English. And I said, not even Spanish? And they said, not even Spanish. And I'm going, what? Well, we have to have things in French. I said, well, they said no. And that we had to fight and all that. We came to a kind of a negotiated settlement on that one. But it would be good if that sort of, it has to be in English or we won't. It has to only be in English or you can just forget it. I mean, I think that needs to go. That just needs to go. And it's not going fast enough, but we can do everything we can possibly do to help it along, I think.
So Ben, I speak English as an additional language. So I started to learn English actually pretty late, when I was 20 or something. So every kind of every presentation for me is an attempt just to listen to people who are speaking the language, if it's in English, which is not mine. So, and as you see, I've survived. So I'm not always I spoke English like this. I think it was a learning curve. I think the biggest advantage of monolinguals attending multilingual conferences is really just realizing that the scene is really complex, and I think that's a great advantage. So I think people who attend languages that they don't speak typically have a connection with that language in an academic venue. So it's not like that you really just go and attend every language presentations with languages you don't know. I think typically you have a connection with that language, you are interested in the research about that language, or you have a connection with that community. So I think it's really both. I think it's an experience, but it's not only kind of an experience which is just for the sake of an experience, because I think you could just go and watch TV or listen to radio, which I think language learners do a lot of. I think at the same time, there is an academic connection already that people explore. So what happens if you have more languages in your conferences? You're gonna attract the speakers of those languages. So I think that first step is or you're going to attract people who are learning those languages, or who are focusing on the communities where those languages are spoken. So I think the most important step is just opening up that possibilities. Then the formats, I think, are gonna be created organically. There might be need for translation, there might be need for subtitles, and I think the nature of those presentations is gonna develop very organically.